Hello, welcome to vertex form of a parabola. So today we're going to talk about what is vertex form. So here we have vertex form. We have y equals a times x minus h all squared plus k. A stands for your slope, so yes, still rise over run, and your vertex is h comma k. What I want you to notice is up here we have a minus h, but down here it's h. So what that tells me is whatever number is in here in those parentheses, you have to change the sign. That's going to be the one thing where you might have a little bit of an error. So make sure you change the sign of whatever the number is in there. So we're first going to take a look at an equation that is in vertex form. So y equals, we'll say 2 times x plus 3 all squared minus 1. So we're going to try to graph this. So first thing you need to understand, your a or your slope is 2, and then your vertex is the number that's here in the parentheses, but we have to change the sign. So since I see a plus 3, that means I'm going to make this a minus 3. And then we're going to look at the number that's outside the parentheses. So since it's a minus 1, that one actually does stay the same. So my vertex is at negative 3, negative 1. So when we graph this, we first need to graph the vertex. So we're going to graph at negative 3, negative 1. And then we're going to count the slope from that. So our normal slope, we would count from the dot and go up 1, 2, over 1 and put a dot. Since it's a parabola, please remember that it is symmetric. So we're going to go ahead and go up 2 and left 1 as well, and that gives me the graph of my parabola. So what we're going to talk about now is how do we put an equation into this vertex form? Well, there's no easy step-by-step method. So we're just going to go ahead and go through, and I'm going to talk about how we do this. We're going to learn something called completing the square. So we're going to start, your first thing is to separate your first two terms from the last term. So I'm going to write the x squared minus 2x. I'm going to leave a blank and put the plus 4 on the outside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to complete this square, which means I'm going to make this factorable. So what you do is you're going to write down what our b is, which in this case our b is a negative 2. You're going to find out what half of that b is, which in this case would be a negative 1, and then you're going to square that. So half your b, and you're going to square whatever that number is. So negative 1 squared is a positive 1. That's going to be what you put in this blank. And then you can't just add in a number and expect it to not change the equation. So since we added a 1 in, I'm also going to subtract a 1 from the outside. So what we're going to do now is we are going to factor what is in these parentheses. So if I looked at it and did a normal factoring, did my double parentheses here, remember the first two numbers would have to multiply to be the first one, so I get an x and an x. The last two numbers have to multiply to be the last one. So to have a 1 and a 1, and since I want a negative 2 here, that means they're both going to have to be minus 1s. Well, what we're going to do, instead of writing the x minus 1, if you remember in vertex form, we had the square on the outside of it. So instead of having that, we're just going to go ahead and put a square on that parentheses instead of writing x minus 1 twice. Then we're going to go ahead and combine the plus 4 and the minus 1, which would give me a plus 3, and this is now in vertex form. Then from there we can graph. So again, your a, since there's no number in front of the parentheses, would be a 1, and your vertex, please remember you have to change the sign of the number that's in the parentheses. So since it's a minus 1, I'm going to put a positive 1, and you keep the sign of the number that's on the outside. So the vertex would be at 1, 3, and then you will graph from there. So what happens if there's an actual number in front of that x squared? It's going to make it a little bit harder. or there's an extra step that we have to do in there. So before I take and put these first two numbers in the parentheses, I have to divide out this -2 from both of these two, because those are the ones that are in parentheses. Why do I have to? Because you cannot complete the square when there is a number in front of that x squared. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both of these by a -2. Now that -2 does not disappear. It's still going to be in front of those parentheses, so it'll be -2, and then -2 divided by -2, that's going to give me an x squared. And then when I do this 4 divided by a -2, that's going to give me a -2x. I'm going to leave my space and put a +1. So again, to figure out what is in that blank spot, I need to write down my b, but this time it's the b that's in the parentheses, not the original b. You're going to use the b in the parentheses. So we're going to put b equals -2. I have to do my half b, which gives me a -1, and then I have to square that, which would then give me a +1. So I'm going to put that +1 in the parentheses. Then what I'm going to have to do now that's a little bit different, if you see this, it looks like that -2 is distributing to each of those three numbers, which in fact it is. So in order to cancel out that +1, I have to take the +1 times the -2, which would give me a -2, and that's what's going to cancel out on the outside. So opposite of -2 is +2. So when I write down the factored form, it would be y equals, still keep the -2. Remember, the first number multiplies to be the first number, so in this case, x squared is just going to give me an x. Last number has to multiply to give me the last one, so it would be 1. Since I need a -2, I need a minus. But each time, the whole point of completing the square is these two would factor out to be the same exact thing in both parentheses. Then combine what's on the outside, which would be a +3. So from there, I would graph. So next thing, we'll go ahead and talk about this problem. I'll ask a couple questions, but we'll go over this one a bit more in class, just so you can see another example of how to put this in vertex form when there's a number in front of the x squared. Last thing I want to talk about is when we have a graph and we want to find out, well, what is the equation of this parabola graph here? So anytime we're looking at this, all you need is your slope and your vertex. So in this case, I can see the vertex of the parabola is at this point, which would be the coordinate -1, +2. And then from there, what I want to do is I find another point that my parabola goes through. So in this case, it would be here at the y-intercept. So I'm going to count my slope from the vertex down to that y-intercept. So that would be a -1, 2, 3 over 1. So I would have a slope of -3. So when I put the vertex and the slope into the equation, so into the form y equals a times x minus h all squared plus k, my a is -3. So if you see, a has the -3 there. Yes, I had a vertex of -1, +2, but remember when I put that -1 in place of the h, it's a -1, which makes it a +1, and then +2. So my answer here for the proper equation would be A.